My sister cheered and applauded when my father hit me in front of 60 people and shouted, "Give us the house! You have no children!" My mother laughed. "You're just a barren fool." So I made a quiet phone call, surprising them all. I don't like noisy banquets, but that Saturday night I pretended to feel like a fish in water. I held a glass of non-alcoholic champagne, smiled at my relatives, and repeated the same polite phrases as if I were giving a lecture on social stratification and family roles. Outside the windows of the clubhouse, the pine forest was thick with the smell of wet pine needles and expensive grills, and inside, the air cut my eyes with a mixture of perfume, vanilla cigarillos, and feigned enthusiasm, the perfect backdrop for a conversation about inheritance. We gathered as a family all the time, but usually it was cozy backyard barbecues or Christmas breakfasts. Today, it looked theatrical, a circular room with columns, ivory tablecloths, live orchid lamps and glass cylinders. Father clearly wanted to show the extent of the greatness of the Hale family. He seated the guests according to the principle of importance. Those close to the stage, those farther away by the exit to the smoking veranda. I was seated to the left of the piano, like an acoustic screen between the instrument and the audience. While the waiters were pouring the wine, Aunt Agatha leaned over to me and whispered, "Don't make a scene, because Daddy's having a hard time." She'd forgotten that the last time I'd made a scene was in 9th grade, when I'd refused to dance with a boy who was pulling my pigtail. I responded with the standard teacher's phrase, "Thank you for your concern. I will take your concern into consideration." The words came out like a diagnosis. There was gossip going around the room. The house needs to be formalized to make it easier for Lauren with the mortgage. Anne died in science. She doesn't need square footage. So what if Grandpa said otherwise? The old man is confused. I listened to these lines like student projects full of methodological errors. Interesting, but unsubstantiated. The trio orchestra played muted jazz, and as the pianist moved to Autumn Leaves, my father stepped up to the makeshift stage. Henry Hale has loved spectacular introductions since he was a kid. A short laugh, a loud clap of the palms of his hands as if testing the acoustics. He's 70, but he still commands the auditorium as he once commanded the deck of a landing craft. The wrinkles on his forehead resembled old maps with battles marked. "Family," he proclaimed, resting his fists on the tabletop. "Today, we will decide the fate of our heritage." Lauren, who sat in the front row with her husband and children, gave me the look of a high school talent contest winner. The sequins shimmered on her gold-colored dress, reflecting the candles. Nephew Brandon, age 7, waved a flag that read, "Team Mom." Symbolic, wasn't it? I took a deep breath. 6 months of research on hierarchical rituals of public humiliation was running in the background in my head, and the evening was slowly turning into a hands-on workshop. I rose to clarify the details of the contract. "Before we move on to the signing," I began in the even tone of a lecturer, "I need a copy of the draft and an explanation of the tax implications." The words were still in the air when my father, like a giant spring, shot toward me. His shadow covered me, and I heard my companion at the next table hurriedly push back his chair, as if anticipating the shaking of the ground. "Stop being clever," he shouted. When a man speaks, a woman is silent. The blow was sharp but accurate. Military experience. A palm smelling of aftershave slashed my cheek, knocking me back against the varnished piano. The hidden string gave out a false chord, as if it was dumbfounded by such a cannonade. For a second, the hall froze. People blinked stunned, yanked their napkins, as if trying to erase this scene from reality. And then the clapping erupted, not chaotic, but almost rhythmic, set by Lauren. She clapped her palms above her head like a conductor setting the tempo for an orchestra of hate. "Give us the house! You don't have children!" my sister shouted, and laughter pierced my ears with a fine needle. Mother Marcia slid her finger over the glass, toasting. "To our barren but still stubborn Anne!" My cheek burned, but the pain inside was of a different nature, not physical, but as old as my parents' first hints that a woman without a child was a half-finished personality. I blinked, and for a second the hall dimmed, like a photograph on which water had been spilled. But a pedagogical habit saved the day. "Keep the structure, colleagues." I straightened up, slowly lowered my hand, checking if it was shaking. "Excuse me," I said. "I need to get some air." The voices merged into a buzz. "Finicky. Dramatizing. She's always had delicate health, hasn't she?" The club doors closed softly behind me, as if afraid of spoiling the drama. The hallway smelled of polish and the cleaning lady's minty gum. I walked on the carpet, red spirals of pattern swirling under my feet, and caught myself thinking, I'm a teacher, so I must know how to pause. The terrace greeted me with the rustle of fir trees and the amber of sunset. I dialed a number. "Mr. Stanton?" The voice trembled only on the first syllable. "Activate grandfather's deed. Yes, an irrevocable trust dated August 25th, 2021. Right away?" "Immediately," I answered, and let my back rest against the stone parapet. A seagull flew overhead, screeching as if to echo Lauren's words. My cheek throbbed, but the cold air soaked up the heat. I remembered my grandfather slowly folding papers into a brown folder. If you're ever asked to step into someone's shadow, turn on the light and see who closes their eyes first. His words seemed poetic then, legal now. I went back into the auditorium through the side entrance. The orchestra was playing again. Waiters were laying out desserts. The family pretend school continued. Lauren was laughing so infectiously that even the candles shook with delight. I adjusted my glasses, wiping the frames with a napkin so they wouldn't shine under the spotlight. I headed straight to my sister's table, feeling my phone vibrate, notices of deed filings at the registry. "Lauren," I said loudly, practicing my diction, "I hope the house gives you as much joy as you're giving this evening." She blinked, lips ajar, but the words stuck. Staring at me intently, like a student who'd missed an entire semester and was now trying to figure out the right answer from the look on my face, Lauren raised her hand for another gesture of victory, but lowered it when she saw my calm smile. I turned around, leaving a swarm of gossip behind me. On my way out, I met my cousin Tobias, who whispered, "Anne, are you all right?" "It would have been worse if I'd kept quiet," I said, and touched my swollen cheek with my fingertips. "Thank you for doing this." The parking lot smelled of gasoline and the evening chill. I got in the car, slammed the door, and the club noise turned into a deafening bass. A new message from Stanton flashed on my phone screen. "Document activated. Notification to family is within 7 business days." I placed the phone on the dashboard, turned on the headlights, and saw my reflection in the mirror. A scarlet palm print turned into a textbook illustration for a lecture on symbolic violence. "Sometimes the loudest act is the quietest call," I whispered, and pressed the starter button. The headlights cut across the forest road, and behind me, in the lighted windows of the club, silhouettes fluttered, small figures on the stage of someone else's play. The orchestra still seemed to be playing Autumn Leaves, only now each note fell into the darkness like leaves never destined to take root. The road to the highway ran along the bay, and as I drove, a mute argument was going on inside me between the professional sociologist and the abused daughter. The former was recording the details of the scene, the ages of the participants, the gender roles, the public control over the body of the deviant family member. The second was chewing the taste of metallic blood on the inside of her lip. A red light came on at the intersection. I closed my eyes and saw my father's hand rise again. But instead of a blow, another picture surfaced. I'm 15, winning first prize for an essay on human dignity, and he says, "Good job, just don't get cocky." At the time, I took it as a concern. Today, I realize it was a project of restraint. The traffic light changed to green, and the car quietly entered the federal highway. The radio offered sports news. I switched to the classical wave. There was an aria from Rusalka, sad and beautiful, like an underwater echo of my childhood. The words about infertility rolled around in my head, colliding with clinical terms like pinballs. I remembered the IVF procedure, the doctor's cold gloves, and then my mom calling, "Well, will you show me your grandson for Christmas?" When I replied that the embryos hadn't taken root, there was a tense silence that lasted longer than the longest of lectures. I turned on the voice pad on my phone and dictated, "Note to the article on violence. A public punch is not always meant for the victim. More often, it is a signal to the pack to maintain the hierarchy." Then she added, "And another thing, It's worth researching what happens when the victim wields documents more powerfully than fists. Half an hour later, I was home. The townhouse was silent, scented with jasmine tea. I wandered from room to room, checking windows, not from fear, but to keep my hands busy. My cheek ached, but deeper hurt sat behind my sternum, where the old "I'm not enough" feeling lived. In the office, I pulled the trust from the safe. Grandpa's shaky yet graceful signature read, "All clear, Anne. Remember, silence is also the answer." On the desk lay my unclaimed research, Quiet Forms of Resistance in Late Modern Families. Today, the theory proved itself. One simple yes to a lawyer, and the family hierarchy cracked. I switched off the lamp, leaving my grandfather's worn conductor's baton on the shelf, its faded varnish still fitting my hand for the rhythm. 1, 2, 3, pause. Before going to bed, I put a cold pack to my cheek, logged into the university portal, and canceled tomorrow's seminar. In place of the topic, social conformity violence, I put in the succinct, cancel due to personal circumstances. Students will understand. Sometimes reality presents a field of inquiry outside the classroom. In bed, I listened to the wind blow for a long time and thought about how my sister would wake up tomorrow in her immaculate home, not knowing that exactly 1 week later she would receive a registered letter. A home is not just walls. It is the power of silence entrusted to a person who doesn't slam doors. With that thought, I fell asleep, feeling not the taste of defeat, but the anticipation of change on my lips for the first time in years. I grew up in the suburb of Bellevue, where pine trees reach for the sky and the windows of Seattle's skyscrapers glint in the lakes like alien lights in a rippling dish of water. Our house stood on the edge of a quiet street, white siding, a red door, a small dock for a canoe that never found its time. It looked immaculate on the outside. Inside, there were the sounds of a command bridge and the sharp smell of nail polish. Dad, Henry Hale, had become a sailor right out of high school. The storms had trained him to be a tough patriarch. He returned from voyages as a rare guest, but even in his absence he kept us in awe. The morning schedule hung on the refrigerator like a battle order. Sick days, tears, caprices were not accepted. In our family, weakness was a violation of the charter. I remember Saturday mornings at 6 o'clock. A faint dawn, wet grass between my fingers. My father would herd Lauren and me onto the porch, measuring us with his gaze as if we were a carriage. Raise the flag! And we'd reach for the ancient flagpole. Then followed across to the bus stop and a minute's readiness for unforeseen challenges. I memorized the route. My breathing was shaking, but my heart was learning to beat in a set rhythm. When my stepfather returned from the seas, he squinted at the world of civilian life as if it were a sluggish doldrums. I was amazed at how quickly conversations turned into orders. Take your elbows off the table. Answer clearly. Any attempt to defend an opinion ended with an abrupt gesture. Conversations about feelings were so rare in our home that they seemed like a foreign language. My mother, Marcia, is a business hurricane. Starting with a small nail salon, she built a chain of Hale beauty salons. Glossy magazines reported on her innovative methods, while at home it all boiled down to one motto: love yourself before others beat you to it. Other people's views were her currency. In the evenings, she practiced her smile standing under the kitchen lamp and taught us, "Girls, the world is a shop window. The shop window is a war for attention." Marcia's every phrase cut sharper than scissors. When I came home from school with a red diploma, she quipped, "That's great, but remember, red ribbons rarely go with white brides' dresses." And on the day Lauren received an invitation to the school prom, my mom said with tears of happiness, "We're finally going to have a real princess in our house." I stood by her side like a ruler used to measure the length of a little sister's happiness. I learned to conquer space with another currency: knowledge. Each 5-point test was a brick in the bridge to freedom. As peers argued over which college was more prestigious, I was already planning my PhD research on the invisible power structure in families. The library became my port of call. In high school, I won the Sociology Olympiad. The principal announced, "Anne Hale is taking the time challenge." Behind that phrase were hours of sleepless nights. At home, my dad just said, "Well done," like he was stamping an envelope. Lauren caught my eye, shrugged. I can shine without books. Lauren has always been a party that happens off the schedule. At prom, she showed up in a champagne-colored gown. It seemed the entire auditorium was whispering just her name. The result, the title Prom Queen, a photo on the newspaper stand, and her mom's tears of joy. A year later, Lauren had an affair with Doug, the shady high school hero who had a smile wider than a soccer field. They married hastily, church with white roses, limousines, draped chairs. My mother was thrashing around like a director, and my father cried for the first time, not from emotion, but from pride that the family name would continue. I watched from the pulpit of University Hall that day, before defending a term paper on the myths of reproductive success. Photos of a wedding bouquet flashed on my phone. With one hand, I pressed the like button, with the other that elite key. I erased the unnecessary comment, "So happy for my sister." Then the children began, like manifestos. First son, "We can," daughter, "We are perfect," second son, "We are winning." Each of Lauren's social media posts sounded like an ode. Happy mom of 3 champions. There were hundreds of reactions underneath, and my posts about gender inequality garnered a dozen happy classmates. I was 31 when the doctor pronounced, "Endometrial failure." The words rang out like needles spilling out of a metal bowl. 6 months later, a second miscarriage. The smell of chlorine lingered in the hospital corridor, and the quiet wheels of the gurneys creaked like someone else's fate. I remember coming home, holding a piece of paper with recommendations and listening to the rain. I called my mother, hoping for a simple, "I'm here for you." She sighed. "The news is not happy, but it's all for the best. Not every woman is cut out for motherhood." A couple weeks later, I showed up for a family dinner. Lauren, tanned from her vacation, presented a new bracelet with the words, "A memento of the miracle of life." My teeth chattered at the sweetness of her tone. When Aunt Agatha jokingly asked me to let my mother-in-law brag, I realized, reproductive success here is soldered on like glitter on Christmas toys and shimmers directly into the eyes of someone who'd prefer a quiet library. The diagnosis became my stranger badge. It wasn't visible until someone elbowed me. "Remind me, why no kids?" At conferences, I explained to students that modern society devalues reproductive freedom, but at home I could feel it in my skin. The theory beats quieter than my own mother's taunt. Between these lively fireworks of my family stood Grandpa Walter, a former school principal who loved everything orderly and yet trembled at the baby whisperer. When we visited him in the summer, he would turn off the TV and suggest we listen to Noon. On his veranda lay a gray-blue plaid. It overlooked a small lake. The mosquitoes tinkled like the strings of a badly tuned guitar, and Grandpa would say, "Do you hear the boat motors quieting down, Anne? They quiet down so the water doesn't forget to be a mirror. A person needs silence, too, to remember the shape of the heart." We sat like that for hours. I would ask questions about books, and Grandfather would answer briefly, as if he wanted me to shake out the lines myself. It was possible to be silent with him, and the silence became a friendly dance. One day, when my parents left for dinner and Lauren was taking selfies on the pier, he pulled a folder out of an old safe and held it out to me. "If the truth ever becomes a racket, open this." I remembered his look, affectionate but wary, like a man who sees a storm on the horizon. I put the folder under my pillow and didn't open it until after his death. 4 years ago, Grandpa died quietly, behind a book. My father organized the funeral according to naval protocol. A guard of cadets, 3 volleys in the air. Mother posed to the press. Principal Hale raised a generation of leaders. I stood by the casket and felt the crumbs of gravel crushing my heels. After the priest's speech, Father received a yellow envelope from the notary. I expected him to unfold it, but he only nodded. In the car, I asked what it was. "School fund recommendations." He tossed it. Mom blatantly changed the subject to the ritual flower showroom. Lauren was discussing what frame to pick for a memorial collage. During the night, I lay in the hotel, reviewing the photos from the funeral and catching myself thinking I'd buried not only my grandfather, but my chance to be heard. Toward morning, I looked in the minibar, something I rarely did, But then the whiskey burned my throat. In the mirror, my eyelashes glistened with salt. Always a backup. I wanted to write on my forehead, so I wouldn't have to wait for the coach's bed again. The days at the university flowed like rivers under ice. I lectured on social control, discussing Foucault and Anderson with graduate students. The students listened, nodded, swooned as I derived formulas of power on the whiteboard. In that moment, the world seemed right. Words had weight by the strength of their argument, not by the loudness of their shouting. I wanted to bring this model home, but in my parents' house, even science prize certificates served as coffee cup holders. Once a month, I traveled to family dinners, as if to validate the experimental observation. Can one survive knowing that every infertility joke will be served for dessert? I used to bring my nephews robotics kits. They would get excited, but a week later, Mom would write, "The Legos are lying under the bed, a waste." But a new costume for Lauren for the Best Neighborhood Mom Award was instantly on the family WhatsApp. Sometimes, watching Lauren, I felt a strange chill. Behind the extravaganza photos were the bruises of fatigue under her eyes. Beneath the perfect captions was a subtle squeak of loneliness. At the height of the quarantine, she texted me nightly, "How do you cope with the silence? The kids are yelling, but it's empty inside." I'd give advice about breathing practices, and in the morning, I'd wake up feeling like I'd drawn a life preserver, but thrown it in a puddle. Once the whole family gathered, however, Lauren put on a glow like ring armor. Her laughter filled the space so densely it seemed like jukebox music. Fun, but the headphones hurt. And each time, I felt my mom's slanted gaze signify, "Learn to shine, Anne, not analyze." The first stage was doubt. The second was anger. I was ready to pound my fists on the table, yelling, "Dad, show me the envelope!" Third, shame. What if it's really just old receipts? Fourth, detachment. Immersing myself in articles to drown out the inner hum. Fifth, forgetting. Convincing myself that family knows best. I lived with these stages as if they were invisible Morse code that my heart was hammering away. But my grandfather's whisper, "Keep quiet," returned with every full moon and cannonade of fireworks at Lauren's holidays. A month before the fateful banquet, my mother invited me for a mimosa breakfast at the flagship salon. We sat by a gurgling fountain, smelling of citrus and ammonia. "Annie," she began, stroking her gemstone bracelet, "it's a big house, and you have enough of your townhouse. Why not give Lauren a gift?" I picked up a napkin, wiped an invisible crumb off the table, and asked, "Mom, what about Grandpa's will? Have you seen it?" She grinned. "Walter was old. He used to mess up papers. Don't get all wave theories." The word "messed up" worked like a blade. Grandpa, who read the papers at 3 o'clock in the morning, didn't even mess up ties. Back at the university, I printed out a pamphlet, "The Rights of an Heir Under an Irrevocable Trust," and stuffed it in my desk drawer, like an expired drug, scary to throw away, but even scarier to swallow. When the invitation to the family inheritance discussion came, I felt that same bumblebee beneath my ribs. I put on my calmest dress, like camouflage among the sequins of the future scene. You already know the rest. One bang, my sister's clapping, my mother's laughter, and my quiet call. 2 days later, I awoke to the sharp crackle of notifications. A firestorm of words was going on in the Haley Forever family chat room. 13 unread messages were turning my phone screen into a flashing red alarm marker. Father, 0612. Anne, call me. We need to resolve this amicably, without lawyers. Mother, 0615. You don't realize you're dragging the family into a scandal. Lauren has kids. Lauren, 0622. Audio message, 70 seconds of hysterical shorthand involving the words traitor, greed, and my boys cried. I flipped to the academic calendar as if checking my reality a seminar on sociology of trauma at 10. The irony of the day, teaching about wounds while my own still throbbed. At breakfast, I diluted the thick silence with cereal. A Harvard lecturer was blaring in my headphones. Power is the ability to define the scope of a conversation. I pressed pause when my phone flashed my father's inbox. Rejected and typed a voice memo. Frames narrow when the aggressor runs out of arguments. I wrote it down in a cracked voice, but didn't let the tears break through. By 10, I was standing outside the auditorium. Students with sleepy faces were strutting about public humiliation as a tool of family control. Some were sleeping, some were typing. But when I mentioned the example of maternal mockery of infertility as a way of preserving patriarchy, the air was constricted by a thread. I even felt like I was speaking too loudly. I lowered my voice and saw, the quieter the words, the more they cling. After the lecture, Layla, a graduate student, caught up with me at the blackboard. "Professor Hale, was your presentation today personal?" I smiled. Personal experience is the most expensive source of data. The key is to anonymize it properly. At noon, I sat in the psychologist's office, my first visit in 3 years. A wall of light cedar, a cocoon chair, the smell of pine oil. Dr. Mayer bowed her head. "Did you feel life threatened when your father raised his hand?" I shook my head. No, more like a threat to existence, like my worth had been written off completely. And the call to the lawyer? Autopilot kicked in. I didn't think about revenge. I turned off the sound of their orchestra. She made a note. The graphite of the pencil rustled like a mouse in the wall. By evening, the phone ran out of battery from texting. I set it on the kitchen counter and stepped into the shower, the hot water pouring while my thoughts unraveled like glued pages. When I returned, a new chat room called Justice for Lauren's Kids was flashing on the screen. It already had 25 participants, most of them distant cousins and sisters' girlfriends from her mom's salon chain. The main message is emblazoned: sign the petition to get Anne's house back to her real family. Below that is a photo of the mansion with the caption, "For the sake of my little one's happy childhood." I closed the messenger, wrote a short letter to the broker. "I'm ready to discuss the terms of long-term lease of the house. I'll get the keys after the current tenants, Hale family, move out." After a pause, she added, "Please provide a contact for a foundation that supports victims of domestic violence. A portion of the payments will go there." At 7 p.m., the doorbell rang. A FedEx courier stood behind the hallway glass, going through a folder like hotcakes. "For Mr. and Mrs. Hale," he specified the address. "Please deliver it personally. They don't live at this address." Then sign for the sender. I signed my name and closed the door and took a deep breath. Official notice of ownership transfer in red on the envelope. Judging by the postmark, similar envelopes were already flying to my parents' doorstep. I pictured them, mother with a glass of Chardonnay, father in an armchair, newspaper shaking in his hands. One moment of truth is worth 100 empty toasts. An hour later, my mother called on FaceTime. I held the phone up, seeing the defocused backdrop of the living room. Boxes, knocked over paintings, as if a hurricane had swept through the interior. "Anne!" Her eyes glistened with moisture, but her lips held their shape. "It's cruel. You know father is a heart man." "Mother, the trust went into effect 4 years ago. You were living there illegally." "No one knew." She flared up. "You have an obligation to take care of us." "I'm offering to help with the move and a year's rent on the new apartment," I replied, trying not to let my voice waver. "Generous," my mother grinned. "But what will people say? People will say that the adults had to honor the legal document they were trying to hide." The screen froze. Lauren flashed behind the mother's back. Her arrow eyes swept over me, and she shouted, "The children are already crying! Their house is being taken!" "Their house was never theirs, Lauren," I whispered and cut the connection. It had been a short night. My phone vibrated every 15 minutes. I set the device to Do Not Disturb and opened a draft of The House as a Marker of Family Power. Writing while it was still light. When inheritance is distributed according to reproductive utility, infertility becomes a stamp of devaluation. But legal literacy can become an act of resistance. At 3 in the morning came a letter from a broker. Tenant interest, young couple with infant, ready to move in a month. The rate is market rate, plus ready to invest in repairs. And I caught myself smiling. Maybe the house would finally hear another laugh. In the morning, the postal blue truck parked in front of the Hale mansion. I'd hooked up the city's webcam. The mailman took out a yellow envelope, placed it on the porch. My mother opened the door as if she wanted to blow out the world in one breath. In that instant, the sun poked into the lens, and the picture flashed as if the document were already burning in her hands. By lunchtime, her father sent a formal, threatening letter. "We'll contest the trust. This is war." I forwarded it to Mr. Stanton. 5 minutes later, I got a reply. "No grounds. We suggest mediation, but before that, a 30-day eviction demand." I signed electronically. It's amazing how easy it is to hit the send button when you were taught as a child to keep quiet. That evening, Lauren posted a lengthy Instagram post. Selfies of crying-eyed kids, the hashtag #HashHouseOut, a tone between pleading and accusatory. The comments were divided. Half branded my coldness, half asked why grown people would count on someone else's property. I didn't respond. Instead, I posted a photo of my grandfather's porch, an empty wicker chair, the silence of the lake, and the caption, "The easiest thing to condemn is choice. The hardest thing is to know the will." I turned off the comments. At night, I dreamed of my grandfather. He was playing his fingernails on the wooden windowsill, and the sound was quiet but distinct, like the click of a feather. "Have you heard that noise before, Anne?" he asked in his sleep. I had heard it, but I didn't understand it. "Now you do, and don't shout. Let those who have no document shout." I woke to the whispering of the pines, as if they were applauding, not Lauren. My cheek didn't hurt anymore. The mirror reflected a new crease of confidence around her mouth. The glasses sat steady. Today, I felt not schadenfreude, but a steady breath of freedom. My phone woke me up before dawn with an insistent vibrating, as if a cracked alarm clock from an old cartoon had started under my pillow. The screen was flooded with parental chat messages. Dad's habitually chopped-up style looked like lines from a nautical magazine. "Anne, call me back immediately. Serious conversation." Mom followed with a hoarse voice. "Think of the family's reputation. You're a teacher, not a scandalizer." Lauren recorded a long, hoarse monologue. She whispered deliberately so the kids wouldn't wake up, but with each word she broke down into a shriek about how I'd ruined their dream home. At first, I put my phone on silent mode, but my habit as a researcher made me look through the messages, highlighting each argument internally with a yellow marker. Pressure through guilt, a reference to my father's health, a plea to remember what sisterly love is. At the bottom of the list was a new chat room called Protect Lauren's Children, where cousins, salon friends, her oldest son's baseball coach, and even some former classmate to whom I hadn't responded to a congratulatory message 10 years ago had already joined. The petition headline screamed with the slogan, "Let's give back the house to those who extend the Hale family line." I closed the messenger and turned on the kettle in the kitchen. The sound of boiling water always put my thoughts in order better than any meditation. There was a stack of term papers on the table about family rituals of shame. I couldn't resist jotting down a fresh quote in my notebook. "When loud voices demand sacrifice, look for documentation. They may have run out of facts." At the university, the students were rocked by a sleepy October morning. I began a lecture on public humiliation as a tool of social cooperation. I told the story of the medieval town shaming posts, and then, almost without raising my tone, brought the bridge to modern family parties, where the right to raise one's hand is equated with the right to defend the family crest. The auditorium became quiet, as if the lights had been turned off. I distinctly heard a pen click for someone in the back row. My attention was sharpened. After class, a graduate student, a shy guy who usually hid his eyes in his laptop, came up to me. He pronounced, "It's impressive to see theory come to life so closely. Thanks." No qualifying questions, just gratitude. And in those 2 words, I felt for the first time that even my bruises could become a supportive text. The journey to the psychologist's office took 15 minutes, but seemed like a step through the desert. Warm light, a cocoon chair, the smell of pine oil. Dr. Mayer listened in silence, then asked if I felt life-threatening. I answered honestly, "No, I felt threatened, as if I had been erased in front of everyone." She pointed out that I had decided not to seek revenge, but to re-establish boundaries. I wrote in pencil on the block, "The silence method." The rustling of graphite sounded comforting, like a manuscript of business correspondence where every letter protects the nerves. When I returned home, I caught a delivery man under the door with a large white envelope. He spoke my name with reverence, as if he were handing me a relic. Inside was a notice of actual transfer of ownership. Tight paper, county coat of arms, signatures, the tangible evidence of my social subjectivity. I involuntarily stroked the seal with my thumb, as if testing the authenticity of the coin. In the compact living room, where the comfort of a bibliophile had long reigned, I arranged the legal documents in neat stacks and took photos for the archive. Then I opened my email. There were letters from Stanton's lawyer waiting. He confirmed that his father had filed a protest, but legally he looked as reliable as a ship with a cracked keel. In the next window was a message from a broker about potential tenants, a young couple with an infant. I liked the idea of a new, non-demanding baby babbling in the house, unburdened by familial pretensions. A video call from the mother interrupted the reflection. On the screen over her shoulder loomed disassembled boxes and a skewed picture of a waterfall, as if a mini hurricane had passed through the house. My mom started by talking about my father's heart, smoothly transitioned to public opinion, then tried to soften, claiming she still loved me. I offered to help with the move and pay rent for the first year if they found a suitable apartment. In response, I heard a rebuke. Generosity without submission is only annoying. With my nephew crying in the background, Lauren snatched up her phone and gave a percussive speech about my inhumanity. I whispered again, "The house was never yours," and disconnected. In the silence of the room, the sound of disconnecting caused a slight dizziness, like finally stepping onto a solid pier after a long rocking ride. I turned on an old velvet jazz vinyl and sighed in time with the beat. The music filled the gaps between resentments. At night, at my desk at work, I opened a draft file titled Home as Armor. Wrote nonstop. About family dynamics where infertility becomes a perpetual pass to the pew. About how legal literacy can become a voice for those who have been taught to be silent. Outside the window, the wind rustled the leaves like a staff clerk flipping through classified reports. In the morning, I found a letter in the university mail from the coordinator of the department, an invitation to give an open lecture on invisible forms of resistance. I froze over the reply key. For the first time in a long time, I wanted to speak loudly, not in a whisper. The postal webcam outside my parents' house updated every 5 seconds. A delivery person appeared in the frame, placed a yellow envelope on the doorstep, and left. At that moment, the sun highlighted the facade as if it were taking a publicity shot of the truth. I caught myself wanting to send a beam of light to my grandfather in the sky. It worked. Dad responded closer to noon. Sent a scan of a handwritten letter in which repeated exclamation points tried to mimic a command whistle. He called my move a coup against the family and demanded an immediate meeting without lawyers. I forwarded the document to Mr. Stanton without adding a line. A few minutes later came the reply. Mediation offer sent. The family's position is legally baseless. I breathed calmly again, as I did before the lecture began. Meanwhile, Lauren's post with the hashtag #StolenHouse was circulating on social media. In the photo, she held crying children near the mansion's open door, swearing in the caption that the house belonged to those who laugh the loudest. There was an instant controversy beneath the image, with some calling me a soulless careerist and others politely suggesting my sister look for housing on the open market. I didn't get involved. Instead, I posted a picture of my grandfather's veranda, an empty chair, the smooth surface of the lake, and a short caption, "Silence sometimes sounds louder than any applause." Comments turned off. That evening, for the first time in a long time, I put the phone in the drawer and let myself just sit in the chair, listening to the clockwork of the wall clock tapping out a steady rhythm. Each beat rang like a confirmation that the world was still moving forward, even as someone tried to rewind the tape to the past. I remembered my grandfather's words, that a whisper requires one to bow to it. Today, it was documents, deadlines, and seals that were leaning toward me. The dream came unexpectedly. I dreamed of my grandfather on the shore of our lake, a light mist, playing his fingernails on the veranda railing as if on the body of an invisible drum. Do you hear that rhythm, Anne? I do, but I only understand it now. Then keep listening and don't be drowned out by another man's orchestra. I awoke to the sensation of the open window, the cool air touching the fresh bruise that still lurked beneath the thin layer of powder. The pain was almost gone, but there was a new crease of confidence near my lips. I walked to the mirror. The reflection no longer looked like a handy daughter or a backup player. In front of me stood a woman who knows what silence sounds like and how to control it. The trucks arrived before dawn, when the streets smelled of wet asphalt and the distant smell of salt water. I stood on the porch, palms clasped around a thermos of green tea, and watched the workmen carry boxes out in a seafaring fashion. Each box was a quiet chapter of my past life. A stack of college notes, a collection of teacups, a chiffonier of neat silk blouses I wore to look dignified at family dinners. It was a strange sensation, as if the things were being taken out not by me, but by a shadow that always followed me before I could say a word. The elevator of the old warehouse loft hummed as if telling a tale of times past, when coffee barrels and tarp bales were rolled through those doors. The walls of the shaft were covered in rusty rivets, but inside the cabin smelled like freshly varnished paint. Climbing up, I closed my eyes and tried to listen to my head to see if there were any more echoes of my mom's orders to keep my voice down so as not to ruin Lauren's presentation. The noise of the motor answered for me. The echo dissolved. I spent the first hour in the empty living room barefoot, step by step, as if I were measuring wooden planks the length of my own freedom. Through the huge windows, the bay slowly opened up. In the fog of Friday morning, tugboats pulled cargo barges like lazy whales. Muffled beeps came from behind the glass, and each beep seemed to signal, "Stay on course." I set the phone aside on the windowsill so it wouldn't flutter under the repetition of family accusations. My morning didn't belong to them now. When Ruth coughed gently at the door, the sun was already highlighting the specks of dust in the air, and a honeyed light flooded the room. She held out a shabby bowl of lavender cookies and a potted cactus painted by a child's hand. "This prickly fellow knows how to store water in store," Ruth said, "and each of us needs to stock up on hope sometimes." Her voice was like a warm scarf, wrapping around and keeping you warm even when you didn't ask for it. We were having tea by the large kitchen island, not yet set up. On the wall was my to-do list, written in chalk. Unpack books, find a handyman to hang shelves, buy basil seeds. Ruth stared at the lines for a long time, and then she said softly, "I see you're used to being ready to run. Things are signed so that you can pack quickly." She didn't demand an explanation, but I did tell her about my father's stroke and the call to the lawyer. The words came out softly, as if I were reading aloud the closed footnotes to my own life. Ruth listened in silence. Then she put her palm on my elbow. "Sea storms have one peculiarity. The sea suddenly becomes mirror calm in the heart of the funnel. You have found your such center. Just hold it until the wind changes again." She tasted the tea as if sealing a promise of mindfulness. After she left, I opened the box of textbooks, alphabetized them, and felt a childlike joy. Each book would finally have a place, uninterrupted by Mom's wedding flyers or Lauren's diplomas. On the top shelf, I put Walter's grandfather's ancient metronome, which for some reason I kept in my postcard box. The quiet clicks of the metronome drew the room into neat time segments, as if to say, "Now your tune is playing here." Before lunch, the electrician stopped by to replace the old track lights. One of them, a long-haired guy, noticed my portrait on my teaching credential and said he'd been to my lecture among the open courses. "You talked about symbolic violence in such a way that I couldn't listen to loud music after a couple." I smiled, feeling for the first time that the work went beyond the amphitheater. The electricians left, and a thought flashed through my mind. Why not invite students to furnish the loft as a social project called Therapy Space? I wrote down the idea in chalk next to the basilica. Soon an email arrived from the broker. "The first rent has arrived." The amount seemed substantial, but not overwhelming. I immediately transferred half of it to a women's support fund. In the column labeled Donor Name, I wrote, "A voice that has been heard." After the click, my heart pounded harder than it once did during my dissertation defense. I barely closed the laptop as an incoming call cracked the calm. The number was hidden, a girlish, quiet voice. "Aunt Anne, please give our house back. Grandma cries every day." I recognized Lauren's daughter. The computer cursor blinked as if expecting my reaction, but I forced myself to speak evenly. "Sweetie, a home is first and foremost safety. It will give security to another family now, and you'll have a cozy new apartment. I'll help." A sob was heard in the receiver, then a solitary why and short beeps. I put the phone in the drawer and put my arms around my shoulders, as if I were trying to comfort the little girl version of myself crying inside, who had also once been told why a calm voice wasn't considered a value. Toward evening, a headline flashed on the screen. Ruthless professor deprived of children's homes. Sign the petition. Lauren plugged some local mom blogger into the campaign. The comments whipped around like an upside-down jug of water. Careerist, heart of stone, parentless infertility. I took a deep breath, and instead of responding, I went into my blog setup. I wrote a new post. What's a house for if it hurts to breathe in it? Describing the feeling of frozen air at family gatherings where you only exist if you reproduce the family name. Within half an hour, the post had garnered several hundred likes and reverent, "Thank you, now I understand my silence." By nightfall, an email from the University Press Center arrived. Social media is discussing the situation with your house. Would you like to comment? I stared at the screen for a long time while the warm light of the desk lamp turned my keyboard into a cooled campfire. Finally, I replied, I'll give a comment at an open lecture where I'll discuss hereditary mechanisms of blood pressure. I clicked send and felt the heavy stone I used to carry fall away somewhere inside, the fear that the Institute would turn away if it knew my truth. At night, I dreamed I was standing at the bottom of a dried-up ocean with the old wooden sides of a ship cracking overhead. I shout, but the sound echoes back against the clear wall of water. Suddenly, a lighthouse lights up in the distance, the same one seen from my window, and the water rises, filling the hollow with a void of safety. I woke up with a clear thought. We need to drive down to the bay in the morning and greet the real lighthouse. The morning air at the water's edge smelled of salt and a hint of seaweed. I brought along a thermos and a notebook. I sat down on the concrete parapet, glinting with bits of mica. I remembered Ruth talking about the storm eye. The beacon flashed evenly, and I wrote down, each flash is half a second of silence, half a second of light. That's how balance works. At home, new voicemails from my parents were waiting on the answering machine. Dad said he'd filed a lawsuit for moral indemnity. Mom complained about the scandal and that Lauren wasn't sleeping well. I forwarded the notes to the lawyer, wrote my parents a letter, not rambling but structured, with points for help with the move, paid counseling for my sister and grandchildren, a list of locations of decent 2-bedroom apartments. No recriminations, no excuses, just an even list of suggestions. Toward noon, Ruth knocked again. She was holding an old clay teapot the color of burnt caramel. I brew it when I need to warm my heart, she said, and continued in a half voice. I spoke to the local women's center about you. They want you to do a seminar on psychological boundaries. No lavish presentation, just you and your story. I felt something finally click together inside. The two halves of the puzzle, the academic voice and the human voice. When Ruth left, I opened the loft plan and drew a diagram of the new office. A long desk by the window, a shelf for books, an upholstered reading chair. In the middle of the room, I put a round carpet. It symbolized for me an island of tranquility. I signed each item with a pencil as a dream that was about to materialize. In the evening, filling out an application for an open lecture, I wrote the title, Quiet Strategies for Freedom, and caught the rhythm of the metronome. Tick, 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 and a scene flashed in my head. I was standing on the stage of the university amphitheater, and an invisible grandfather was sitting in the last rows, nodding as if checking a note. Before going to bed, I looked out the window. The lights of the tugboats were reflected on the water like a scattering of amber. I touched the glass with my palm and suddenly said out loud, Home is not walls, but the space inside you where you are not afraid to breathe. The words dissolved in the glass, but echoed back into my heart. The phone was silent. I put the family chat messages on archive. For the first time in years, I fell asleep without the vibrating alarm behind my ear. In my dream, Grandpa wasn't pulling the windowsill strings. He was sitting in a wicker chair, holding Ruth's teapot in his lap. As I approached, he said, Every lighthouse is built on salt and stone, but it shines because of the emptiness inside the glass bulb. I woke with the dawn and sighed. The emptiness inside me had finally been filled with air. The family mansion greeted the morning with a steady light, as if unaware of its own reversal of fortune. The asphalt road glistened after the night's rain, and the drops on the jasmine bushes shimmered like decorations for an ill-fated ball. I pulled up in a car-share electric car, smelling the slight odor of ozone from the still-fresh engine. The porch, clean to a mirror-like shine by my mother, was now littered with cardboard boxes, chairs without covers, and children's scooters. Each thing seemed like a word taken out of a long letter about to be signed and sent off with no chance of return. Huddled on the lawn were the parents, Lauren and Doug. Father stood in his dress coat, but his sea captain's bearing shook like a mast in a stiff wind. Mother held a porcelain vase in her hands and frantically stroked the smooth walls as if they were the wings of an awakened bird. Lauren cradled her youngest son against her hip, and with the fingers of her free hand, she twirled her wedding ring like a talisman against the unknown. Doug pretended to be busy loading things, but his gaze slid back to me every now and then, wary, like a man caught with an unfinished lie. I got out of the car without haste. The clematis vines braiding the pergola smelled tart, a reminder that nature doesn't change the schedule to accommodate our family dramas. As I stepped closer, I felt a wave of old tension rising in me. My body remembered how, within these walls, I had to reduce my breathing to keep from being louder than other people's decisions. But now that wave met a solid shore. There was already a lighthouse inside. As soon as my shoes touched the path, my mother was the first to dismount. "Anne, you see we have nowhere to put the carpeting." The tone was high, taut as a string. "These people who are moving out, they won't realize how many years we've taken care of the house." "Tenants, Mom," I corrected calmly. "And they'll agree to leave the garden untouched if you leave them a scheme for caring for the roses." The words were simple, but I saw my father slump his shoulders. A sailor realized the negotiations were over yesterday when the official deed was already on file at the county register. A representative of the agency drove up to the office van. A young woman with her hair gathered in a bun, a badge on her chest. "Claire." I said hello, held out my paperwork. Claire smiled warmly, like a nurse, and asked where I could sign the deed of acceptance. We stepped back to the garden table, and in the morning sun, the ink lay smoothly and definitively on the paper. With each autograph, the silence thickened. The birds in the spruce crowns seemed to turn down the volume so as not to blur the main chord. When I signed the last signature, Claire secured the papers in a leather folder and handed the keys to the gate to the new tenant, a young African-American woman named Celeste, holding a baby wrapped in a striped blanket. The boy was reaching for the sun's glare as if he wanted to catch it in his fist. I shook Celeste's palm, and she whispered softly, "Thanks for the chance." There was more gratitude in her eyes than my entire family had ever been able to utter. The papers were signed, the deed executed. The lawn stood awkwardly silent for a moment, like the scene after the end credits where the audience is still seated, but already knows the story is over. I headed toward the garage to see if there were any family heirlooms left. The place smelled of dust and motor oil. A felted rug and a few boxes of children's crafts lay on the concrete floor. In the far corner, leaning against an old refrigerator, stood Lauren. The yellow light from the ceiling lamp made her eyes huge and colorless. "Are you happy?" she whispered without raising her head. "I'm not looking for pleasure," I answered. "I was looking for air." She sat down on a folding chair, her hands trembling. "All my life, Anne, I've tried to be a hero to my parents. Kids, pageants, pictures in wedding magazines. I thought if I shined, they'd love me for two. Then I realized they only love their own script. You were silent, and I felt like your silence was a condemnation of my noise. I sat down next to you on the box. My silence was fear. Now it's a choice. We both grew up on the same theater stage, Lauren. It's just that I went backstage." Lauren straddled her knees, breathing often, as if after a long run. "I envied your calm. Envy is rust. It ate away at my armor, and I thought brilliance was strength. I remembered how I had once envied her loud laugh that opened doors before she could touch the handle. We both wore other people's armor. "I'll pay for your therapy," I said. "The foundation has programs that help those who raise children after abuse. You don't have to keep up the act." She looked up, her eyes filled with hope mixed with shame. "Will you forgive me?" "Forgiveness isn't the key, Lauren. The key is choice. I don't promise to forget the blow or the words, but I choose not to live them. The silence grew softer, as if garden moss had grown between the walls of the garage. Lauren nodded, tears falling silently to her knees. I put my palm on her shoulder, not as a signal of peace, but as a point where the long-ago map of the battle ends. When we got to the light, the tenants were coming in with the first boxes. Dad tried to give directions to the movers, but Claire politely stopped him. "I'm sorry, sir, you are no longer responsible." The words didn't sound sarcastic, but dryly businesslike. I saw him turn shakily toward his mother, and for the first time I saw the slight confusion in his steely gaze. Perhaps it was now that he realized that a captain without a ship remained only a man who might also need a map. I offered to help my parents move. Father nodded without looking. Mother only clutched the porcelain vase tighter, as if she was afraid I would take it away too. In the evening, the Free Beacon Foundation's fundraiser was held in the ancient hall of a former bank, converted into an art space. The high ceilings reflected the clinking of glasses and soft chuckles. I entered through a side door, so as not to catch prying eyes, and went straight to the donation table. An envelope with a check was in my bag, with a simple, anonymous voice on it. The amount was equal to a year's rent on the house. "Do you want us to put a name on it anyway?" asked the volunteer, a girl with a short haircut. "The name is not more important than the cause," I replied. "Let the funds begin the work of healing." The opening speech about the power of quiet support was already playing on the stage. I sat at the far table, next to Ruth. She wore a jacket the color of fresh pine needles, warm eyes sparkling with attention. "See how the flame doesn't go out when you put the glass cover on?" she whispered, looking at the decorative lantern in the center of the table. "Your story has become such a hubcap for many." Soon, the host announced the name of a guest speaker from the university who would speak about connecting inner freedom and social structures. I took the stage. My heart was beating steady. The metronome inside was setting the right beat. I spoke about how we have been taught to measure a woman's worth by childbirth, but forgot to mention that every choice can be the birth of our own power. That the silence we were condemned to could become a microphone if we chose to believe its volume. The auditorium listened without a murmur. At one point, I noticed Lauren sitting in the far pair of chairs. She was clutching a folded handkerchief to her chest, and her eyes were shining, not with envy, but with recognition. After the show, Celeste, the young mother from the mansion, came up to me and thanked me. She said she wanted to organize a reading circle for women, and asked if she could meet in the winter garden at home on weekends. I agreed without hesitation. The house must breathe words of healing instead of whispers of complaint. When the evening was over, I walked out to the waterfront. The waves licked the concrete lazily. The lighthouse blinked like a friend meeting my gaze in the crowd. I pulled out my phone, opened my blog, and wrote a short entry. Sometimes the loudest act is to leave behind a space where someone else's voice will ring out with confidence. Published it, and put my phone in my pocket, without checking for likes. Let the words flow on their own, like a seagull in a tailwind. I walked home along the promenade, feeling the air dissolve past resentments, old patterns bending in the darkness, giving way to new connections. A warm lamp burned outside the glass door of the loft, and Ruth's cactus slept beside it. I touched the thorns with my fingertip. They seemed honest rather than sharp. Inside was the same silence that no longer frightened, but sang. I closed my eyes and imagined my grandfather's metronome clicking rhythmically. 1 and 2, inhale, 1 and 2, exhale. And then I asked myself, if the world were silent tomorrow, what sound would you leave for others? I smiled into the darkness. The answer was simple. The sound of my silent step forward turned into a beacon for those who are still afraid to take the first one.
Любі глядачі, дякую вам за перегляд, ставте лайки та підписуйтесь на канал. Також напишіть в коментарях, чи погоджуєтесь ви з Дженніфер, чи вона мала розказати все матері, чи ні, чи мала все розказати своєму коханцю щодо свого чоловіка, чи ні. І також прокоментуйте, чи вам сподобалось це відео.